The ancient temple of Heliopolis was probably the most important, certainly the largest known temple precinct of ancient Egypt. However, only a few traces remain, as over the last 2,500 years Heliopolis has been defiled or picked at for building materials from the Ptolemaic era up to as recently as the 19th century, while the urban expansion of Cairo has continued to cover up the few remaining traces of this once mighty site. During the time of Napoleon's expedition, the surviving enclosure walls were recorded as 12 metres or 39 feet high, and even much older Egyptian records describe them as nearly 15.6 metres or 51 feet wide, dwarfing other famed walls such as at Karnak, the Wall of the Crow at Giza, or the enclosure walls around the stepped Pyramid of Djoser. Often quoted as the largest temple complex of ancient Egypt, Karnak is actually smaller than Heliopolis, with all of its precincts fitting inside the walls of Heliopolis and still leaving room. The surviving obelisk and obelisk fragment at Heliopolis being a shadow of a former glory, with some estimates having 48 obelisks at Heliopolis during its peak, once again dwarfing any other known or described site in ancient Egypt. While even the famous pyramids of Giza were built with a mind to align them to Heliopolis, whether intentional or accidental, this alignment was recently confirmed by the work of Stephen Burrows and his team, using the best modern surveying tools and techniques. Though if this alignment was accidental, then so too was the design of the pyramids at Abu Sir. Yet given Heliopolis was a site of supreme significance as far back as the Old Kingdom up to the Site era, being mentioned in the pyramid texts of Unas from the Old Kingdom, the Book of the Dead, and the Great Harris Papyrus, the intentional alignment of the pyramids to Heliopolis is not something that can be too easily dismissed as coincidence. Heliopolis being a core site of Egyptian spirituality and sciences from the beginning of their recorded history, with archaeological and geophysical finds also showing it was used in prior to the Old Kingdom proper was begun. Heliopolis was the very site the Egyptians held to be the point of creation, the sacred mound where the gods of the Ennead and the world itself came into being. It is hard to imagine a site that could be more sacred, something that the ancient Egyptians reflect in their most sacred texts and in their greatest architecture. That the grandest pyramids individually and collectively point towards Heliopolis cannot be more telling of just how vital it was to the ancient Egyptians. If just the obelisks of Heliopolis that were moved to great cities such as Rome, Florence, London and New York were returned, if the grand statues and walls were still in anything near their original condition, if it hadn't been swallowed by the urban sprawl of Cairo and buried beneath over 10 metres or 33 feet of trash, the temple of Ra-Atum at Heliopolis would be on every must-see list for Egyptian tourists. Yet sadly it is now not only largely forgotten, but under increased threat, as without the value of the tourist dollars generated by sites such as the pyramids and Karnak, and the pressures of Cairo's ever-expanding population giving developers ever more influence, the once great temple of Heliopolis may soon be reduced to a small park surrounding its single surviving complete obelisk. Having examined the history of Heliopolis in more ancient times, let's now look at the records of Heliopolis from the Greco-Roman era, when writers such as Herodotus and Strabo visited the area recording what they saw. Though first a brief history of more recent excavations and finds to put the Greco-Roman records into some perspective, since combined with the ancient Egyptian records as far back as the Old Kingdom, we find a coherent and complementary body of evidence about Heliopolis. In 2017, Heliopolis made world headlines with the discovery of a colossal statue. Initially attributed to Ramses II, it was soon found to belong to one of the Site-era pharaohs, Psamtik I, who ruled in the mid to late 7th century BC. The Site-era kings are said to be the last native rulers of Egypt, existing between conquest by the Persians and the Greek or Ptolemaic era. The Ptolemaic era was begun by Alexander the Great, who himself was crowned a pharaoh of Egypt, and ending with the legendary Cleopatra. Of a Ptolemaic line herself, she was the last pharaoh of Egypt, after which Egypt was officially annexed and absorbed into the Roman Empire. Although Psamtik came in one of the later periods of Egyptian history, his contributions to Heliopolis show the importance of this temple complex. As far back as the Old Kingdom pharaoh Djoser, relics and descriptions emphasize the importance of Heliopolis and its temple to the creator god Atum. The recent excavations of Heliopolis have added to older studies of this vital temple complex, confirming the presence of the mound upon which it sat, the size of as well as the area contained within its unrivaled enclosure walls, also the attention given to it by pharaohs across the long expanse and multiple periods of ancient Egyptian history. During his expedition into Egypt, the French Emperor Napoleon showed a keen interest into the ancient past of that land, something that French leaders including former Prime Minister Mitterrand have curiously continued, such as the red carpet reception given for the body of a pharaoh brought to Paris for examination, or in the glass pyramid built in front of the Louvre, which shares the proportions of a Great Pyramid. Yet this is another long story entirely. Though for Napoleon he brought not only an army of soldiers, but also an army of academics to study the enigma of ancient Egypt. As well as other well-known sites, they also detailed the ruins of Heliopolis. The famed Egyptologist Matthew Flinders Petrie travelled across Egypt, taking careful measurements of the grandest monuments, as well as studying pottery and other less spectacular items. His work remains something of a Bible in relation to Egyptology, as his surveying skills were meticulous, as was his expertise in Egyptian pottery, which also remains highly respected to this day. After negotiating with the Egyptian king, Matthew Flinders Petrie and Ernest Mackay gained access to the site of Heliopolis. Publishing their work in 1915, they detailed their many finds as well as describing the enclosure walls. These descriptions having been recently verified with the archaeological and geophysical works headed by Ayman Ashmawi and Dietrich Rau. It was this team who in 2017 uncovered the pieces of the colossal statue of Psamtik I in Area 200 of the dig. An especially interesting area, given the alignments of the Abu Sir pyramids seem to point exactly at this sanctuary within the larger Heliopolitan complex. www.heliopolisproject.org will be linked in the description, as well as a published paper by the Ashmawi Rao team on their recent digs and geophysical surveys of the site. Now though, let's look at the records left to us by the Greco-Roman era writers such as Herodotus and Strabo. Strabo in particular, since his geography provides a detailed description of Egypt, from the Nile Delta down to sites on the Red Sea where the Romans had large ports and fleets trading huge amounts with India. Along with the writings of Hieron and Vitruvius, who provide a technological as well as a philosophical window into the ancient mindset passed on to the Greeks and Romans via the Egyptians, Strabo's Geography, Book 17, also provides an excellent account of Egypt before the memory of the old priesthoods had entirely vanished, soon enough to become Christianized by the late Roman and early Byzantine empires. A downloadable PDF of Geography Book 17 will be in the description. Chapter 27, page 72 of this PDF is where he begins to describe his visit to Heliopolis. Strabo's account of Egypt begins in the Nile Delta as he travels through several areas of interest. Just before arriving at Heliopolis, he describes the city and temple of Bastet at Bubastis. Herodotus also describes Bubastis as a site of particular grandeur, although it only came into real prominence in the late 10th century BC. Both Herodotus and Strabo describe Bubastis as being on a mound, and as it was in the Nile Delta, and the yearly flooding cycle was still such a defining event, that should be no surprise. Though more than a temple, Bubastis was also a significant city, and the mound upon which it was built appears to be largely man-made. Though just like Heliopolis, the temple at Bubastis has been almost entirely destroyed and the mound levelled for farming. Of special interest to Herodotus, it is also of special interest to myself, for one of the surviving column capitals from that temple is now here in Sydney and in the collection of the Nicholson Museum at the University of Sydney. Moving south from Bubastis, Strabo then comes to Heliopolis, and there he pays special attention to both the site as well as the importance of the priesthood that once lived there. Strabo begins his description of Heliopolis with the notable mound upon which the temple sat, as well as the lakes that surrounded the temple complex, reservoirs that received the overflow from the nearby canal during the yearly flood cycle of Arket. With the development of Cairo, the terrain of the region has been radically altered, the mound having disappeared, as with the lakes, although the nearby canal may be a surviving relic of the ancient past. As with the massive earthworks of Bubastis, the area around the natural mound of Heliopolis may well have been heavily landscaped, although these types of monumental engineering efforts are not as seductive as the ancient stonework even where they do survive. Strabo then describes the temple of Heliopolis as being entirely deserted. He also details the madness and sacrilege of Cambyses, who destroyed or toppled many of the obelisks of Heliopolis. By Strabo's time, 2 of the Heliopolitan obelisks had already been moved to Rome. More would follow. It should be worth mentioning again that Strabo's account of the fallen obelisks at Heliopolis is also spoken of in the Old Testament of the Bible. Jeremiah 43:13 speaks of the fallen obelisks at Heliopolis. In most versions it is actually named as Heliopolis, while in the King James Version of the Bible it is named as Beth Shemesh, which translates to the house of Shemesh, and Shemesh or Shamash was the Mesopotamian sun god, making Beth Shemesh the house of the sun, as in Greek Heliopolis translates to the city of the sun. Strabo then gives an account of the layout of the temple at Heliopolis. His descriptions of the halls inside the temple is not very complimentary. The hall has nothing pleasing or picturesque, but is rather a display of vain toil. Returning to Strabo's account of Heliopolis from chapter 29 of book 17 in his geography, for it is here where Strabo mentions the Heliopolitan priests, and how they not only excelled at astronomy and philosophy, but also how it was they who passed on this knowledge to some of the giants of Greek history after an initiation of 13 years. Based on other writings, Strabo mentions Eudoxus and Plato as being amongst these Greek initiates into the Heliopolitan mystery schools. Eudoxus being a Greek astronomer, and although none of his works survive, he is mentioned in later important writings. Strabo also mentions Plato, who was famous for his geometry. When Strabo says the priests of Heliopolis excelled at philosophy, it is necessary to clarify what he meant by philosophy. In current times, a philosopher might conjure up an image of someone in a beret and a neckerchief, discussing the underlying socio-political meaning of some 19th century poem about the arrangement of flowers in a vase from some equally obscure painting from the 17th century. For the people in the era of Strabo up to Shakespeare, the word philosophy had a very different connotation, such as in the line from Hamlet, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." This line could be rewritten to place it in a more modern context. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your science." For Strabo, the word philosophy was much closer to science than the current day understanding of that word. Though back to Strabo and his account of Heliopolis. Whether or not Plato actually visited Egypt, let alone spent 13 years there, might be argued. However, Strabo describes the houses of the priests in Heliopolis. Long deserted by them, he does call them schools of Plato and Eudoxus, which could also be read as schools of geometry and astronomy. Just as Strabo describes the temple at Heliopolis with the name of the Greek sun god Helios rather than the Egyptian temple of Ra-Atum. However, Strabo does name it as a centre of astronomy, and as far back as the Old Kingdom, the high priests of Heliopolis were named the chief of the observers. Strabo also describes Heliopolis as a centre of philosophy, meaning a centre of science. such as the science of geometry upon which so much else is dependent. Herodotus names the Nile Valley and its yearly flooding as the location where geometry came to be known, and from where it was passed on to the Greeks. Xerxes made a division of the soil of Egypt among the inhabitants. If the river carried away any portion of a man's lot, the king sent servants to examine and determine by measurement the exact extent of his loss. From this practice, I think, geometry first came to be known in Egypt, whence it passed into Greece. Herodotus. This method of land measurement being the 3-4-5 triangle used by Egyptian rope stretchers to survey land lost to the river, so by causing the taxes levied on the farmer to be adjusted. The ancient Egyptians knew of the 3-4-5 triangle, the first of the Pythagorean triplets so important to understanding Pythagorean theorem, which is so important to understanding geometry, and geometry being a foundation stone to all of the hard sciences. It is well recorded that the ancient Egyptians used knotted ropes to make a 3-4-5 triangle for measuring land, yet it is not generally accepted that they understood the important principle underlying the 3-4-5 triangle. That this geometry can also be found in several of the pyramids, including the grandest two of them all, the Pyramid of Khafre and the Great Pyramid, which is a geometry textbook built in stone, containing more than just Pythagorean theorem, but several other geometric problems that apparently weren't solved or even pondered until the Greek era. At least that is the standard view of history, the foundations of geometry being an almost entirely Greek invention, although they themselves credit the Egyptians as their teachers. Strabo also references the Chaldeans as being the teachers of Greece and Rome, the Chaldeans being Mesopotamian. Ancient tablets unearthed in Iraq have shown knowledge of advanced geometry, lending further credit to the very ancient peoples being the ones who taught the ancient Greeks and Romans. Now I shall read a passage from Strabo, for it speaks of the secretive nature of the Egyptian priests, who unlike the Greeks and Romans seem to have been very protective of their astronomical and geometric knowledge, though this passage also points to another very interesting question, the origin of timekeeping. Since these priests excelled in their knowledge of the heavenly bodies, albeit secretive and slow to impart it, Plato and Eudoxus prevailed upon them in time, and by courting their favour to let them learn some of the principles of their doctrines. But the barbarians concealed most things. However, these men did teach them the fractions of the day and the night, which, running over and above the 365 days, fill out the time of the true year. But at that time the true year was unknown amongst the Greeks, as also many other things, until the late astrologers learned them from the men who had translated into Greek the records of the priests. Even to this day they learn their teachings, and likewise those of the Chaldeans. Here we see how the Egyptians and Chaldeans, cultures already ancient to the ancient Greeks and Romans, were the teachers of profound knowledge that still defines us today. More than understanding a true year as being slightly longer than 365 days exactly, the Egyptians also taught the Greeks and Romans about fractions of a day, that being timekeeping. Ancient Egyptian sundials divided the day into 12 hours, and so too the night being 12 hours, thus the 24-hour day we still use presently. Although during the night the Egyptians had a different instrument for measuring that, with some examples still remaining, a relatively simple device using a plumb line and a bar to gauge the steady movement of the constellations across the night sky. Though also the fractions of an hour itself comes into question, an hour being divided into minutes and seconds. Most texts would make such timekeeping a relatively recent invention. Some would credit the Greeks and Romans with water clocks and other devices for accurately dividing up an hour. That the ancient Egyptians could accurately make such measurements would be bitterly disputed by most, if not all, leading Egyptologists. I will not go into that this episode, for it requires a detailed case to be made, although the connection between the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, the pendulum of 1 second, and the Great Pyramid is a lovely series of interrelationships I have explored before. Though this also blends wonderfully into the location of the Great Pyramid in relation to Heliopolis itself. Heliopolis being a centre for geometry, geometry translating into geo, earth, metry, measure, as well as the connections to astronomy and the sciences centred at Heliopolis. In the next episodes, I intend to present new information that will complement existing finds about the Great Pyramid, as well as add weight to my own research, since the importance of Heliopolis and its relationship to the Great Pyramid fits perfectly within this. More than just the metrology, geodesy and geometry, it also blends directly into the alignment of the Great Pyramid to Heliopolis, as well as the distance of the Great Pyramid to Heliopolis, where once the high priest, the chief of the observers, measured the heavens and the earth, as well as time, while also studying geometry and other philosophies. For it was here, from Heliopolis, that the Great Pyramid must have been planned, not only pointing to the Benben, the mound of creation upon which Heliopolis sits. More importantly, when one was on that mound and looked towards the Great Pyramid, they looked directly at its northeast corner, seeing the Great Pyramid for what it is, a three-dimensional object, a seemingly imperfect object because of the slight variations on each side. Yet this imperfection carries profound wisdom, giving a different meaning in the study of geometry and astronomy depending on your perspective. Though from Heliopolis one saw the corner of a Great Pyramid that encodes astronomy and metrology and timekeeping, sacred knowledge through sacred proportions, sacred measures and sacred geometry. Heliopolis was the centre of the earth, and looking from Heliopolis one had the best view of the expression of the earth itself in stone, while also being the exact distance that expresses the great year. From this temple of the sun, the knowledge of earth, moon and stars was laid out before you, there to be measured, and from here to be taught to the rest of the world, from the very centre of the world itself, Heliopolis.